Alright, it's time for another update and forecast on the park fire. We had a lot of growth on it yesterday. The park fire basically woke back up yesterday, so we're going to talk about where that growth was. We're going to go into some of the resources that are on the fire, some of the current numbers. We're going to dive into the weather forecast, what the fire currently looks like right now, and then basically just try to figure out what is this fire going to do throughout the day today and where is it going to move. But before we get into the future, I always like to start with the past, and this is a video from yesterday afternoon. So it wasn't as much wind driven as much as it was due to the heat. We were up in the mid to high 90s in some cases, but even more importantly, the relative humidity dropped down into the teens once again. So as things got a lot drier, and then you see all these abundant fuels that we have out there, it just allowed this fire to take off towards the northeast. So that's what it looked like. You can see those pyrocumulus clouds, and you notice it stayed fairly active even after the sun set, and that's why we're kind of off to a bad start throughout the day today, is we didn't have a great moisture recovery overnight. Relative humidity in some cases actually stayed in the single digits overnight, so that didn't diminish our activity all that much. And you can actually see based on the satellite imagery, we already have some smoke coming off of the fire, and just waiting for the inversion to lift right now. I'm recording this around 11:45. We haven't seen a huge pickup yet, but it was just right around this time yesterday that things started to kind of pop off a little bit. So that's sort of our intro right there. Basic summary, a lot of growth yesterday. There's going to be more hot, dry air over the fire today with abundant fuels, so expecting another active day on the park fire. So before we fill in all the gaps on that, we should just get our bearings here. We have Paradise to the southeast, Chico to the south, Red Bluff to the west. Probably the last time I'm even going to mention those communities throughout the course of this video, because the whole southern and western side of this fire has looked great over really almost a week now. We haven't seen much activity there. It's this northeastern finger of the fire where we had all the heat, and I think this map always shows it best. Where you have those red stars is where we've had recent heat, and you're not seeing any of those red stars, even on the northern side as well, near Manton and Shingletown. So around those communities, as I always say, it's important to stay updated with evacuation orders and warnings. CAL FIRE has more information that they're using than what I can find, so always go to them for that kind of information. But I'll try my best to have a detailed weather forecast for you here. So one thing we can look at on the watch duty is the acreage is now up to 414,000. So just looking at where that was and in the context of the history of this fire, notice how dark blue most of this fire is. That's going to be all the growth that happened in the first week of the fire. So I believe we're now into week 3, because the first week was very active. It started in Chico, rushed up to the north about 30 to 40 miles in just a few days. And then last week, the fire actually calmed down a lot, where you see the yellowish color. We had very little growth last week, but what growth we did have was on this northeastern side, and it was yesterday that this northeastern side flared back up, and that's where you see that new growth right there shown in red. So in terms of, that's the history of the fire, but now in terms of history of California park fire, at 414,000 acres is the number 4 largest wildfire in California history, which puts it behind the Mendocino complex, which is at 460. So we'll have to keep an eye on that to see if it jumps up into third anytime soon. And then structures right there, sometimes this one's not updated as frequently, so I just want to see what the CAL FIRE website says. That one says 636 structures destroyed, 49 structures damaged. And I put the link for this in the description. It's the CAL FIRE page. And a useful resource is this damage assessment map as well. Just in case you are local and you haven't been able to check out how your house might have fared throughout the park fire, what you're able to do on this map is you're able to click a structure, and then it's even going to have a picture of what it looks like. So I always say, but thoughts and prayers go out to everybody who has been impacted by the park fire, because it's been I mean, clearly one of the worst wildfires in California history, and as we saw yesterday, it's not done just yet. It looked like it was almost kind of wrapping up. We hadn't seen much growth for about a week, and then right when that humidity dropped yesterday, the fire activity just jumped right back up again. So when it comes to that growth, we're looking at this progression map, but that doesn't give us too much detail, so we can actually come on over to Google Earth here, and I can just keep an eye on the perimeter here. This is going to give you just kind of a basic idea of where that growth was yesterday. And then we can actually zoom in here. Most of this growth was in the Mill Creek drainage, and then you can see it even jumped up to what I believe they call the Mill Creek Plateau. Don't quote me on that one, though. And then it actually looks like it's coming around the bend right there. And that's where I'm expecting most of the growth to be throughout the day today, because your winds are going to be funneling up this canyon. So it's going to take where we had some activity yesterday and try to continue to push it up this canyon. And you can also see just an example of some of the spot fires that we had yesterday as well. That's one where burning ember gets picked up, dropped into the dry fuels. That's also why it's especially important of how dry it was yesterday. As the fuels get drier, spot fires become more likely, because it's much easier for a burning ember to get dropped in those dry fuels, start a new little fire, and then all of a sudden the fire is basically leapfrogging, and then it's able to go a lot faster. But one thing we can do is just see, like, why did it pick up so much yesterday as compared to previous days? Well, it turns out there's a very kind of nuanced answer for that. I actually asked Zeke Lunder that question during his live stream, and I was thinking it was mostly due to the fact that we didn't have as much smoke over the fire as in previous days. So you can see solar radiation, because we had some challenging forecasts towards the end of last week and into the weekend, but because there had been so much growth previously, there was still a lot of smoke over the fire, and your solar radiation didn't go up all that much in the afternoon because the smoke was blocking us. But what happened yesterday morning is we started off with clear skies, and then our solar radiation went up a lot more. And that allowed us to get hotter than in previous days. You see that warming trend since August 3rd to August 4th to August 5th. That's the day where we got a lot hotter. And then because we're getting hotter and that moisture moved out of California, we've also been drying out as well. This is your relative humidity. It was pretty good over the weekend when all that monsoonal moisture moved in. And then since then, it's been dropping down. And key part of the forecast that we'll get into is that it's not going up as much overnight. So then you're starting off the day with very dry conditions, which just makes it much more likely that you're going to see growth. So that was kind of the weather component side of things. But a great thing that Zeke pointed out as well is in previous days, like, we can even turn off some of that growth that we had, I believe, between Friday and Saturday. This was kind of why I had some false confidence yesterday morning, is we had some challenging conditions over the weekend, but this was about the extent of the growth that we saw right there. But part of the reason for the lack of growth is it was going downhill, and fire doesn't like to go downhill. But what I should have seen yesterday is that once it's established at the bottom of a hill, then it can quickly rush up the hill, especially in the afternoons when you get your winds blowing upslope, because you have a temperature difference between your canyon walls and the canyon bottom. Basically heats up more up here, that air rises, and then it pulls up air from the valley bottom, takes some of that fire that's down there, quickly pushes it up. The other thing that happens is the flames, you could think of them tilting over, almost like if you're holding a match and you tilt it over. It's able to preheat some of the fuels above the fire, so that by the time the fire gets to those fuels, they're already dried out, and then the fire just takes off. And if we zoom out, you can see with the growth yesterday, that's exactly what happened. So that little bit right there that hadn't grown very much as the fire was going downhill, once it got established down here, basically took off. So it's really a combination of everything when it comes to the fire behavior triangle. There's fuel, weather, and topography. Weather, it was hotter, it was drier. Winds weren't a huge factor, but it was slightly windier yesterday than in previous days. Fuels, this is an area that hasn't burned out in decades. We can come back on this map, put on fire history. You got the Ponderosa fire in 2012, between where we've had a lot of that heat activity recently in areas like Manton and Shingletown. So that's actually good news there. Will hopefully provide a little protective barrier. We've got the Dixie Fire to the east, which is hopefully going to provide a nice protective barrier for places like Chester or Lake Almanor. You can actually see that from one of the cameras I was looking at this morning. This is the view just west of Lake Almanor, so within that Dixie burn scar. And look at all those fuels that got burnt out. So you can imagine if the park fire were going to try to move through that, well, it almost just looks like it's a lot of rock on that hill right there. So that's why I'm not too concerned about it pushing all the way to Lake Almanor or anything like that. I'd imagine if it does get to the Dixie burn scar, which again is in red, it'll start to slow down because a lot of those fuels are already cleared out. Key point I'm trying to make, though, is look where it's burning right now. There's no burn scar, so those fuels have just been accumulating for decades, and that's part of the reason this fire has been so active. So that's weather, that's fuel, and then as we're looking at on Google Earth, it's also topography. In two different aspects, you have the aspect that it established at the bottom of the hill yesterday, and then it likes to rush up, but then also the aspect that we have Mill Creek drainage in here, which can funnel winds. You think about how, you can just imagine how that works. I'm just going to use the same metaphor again. I was trying to think of a different one, but I mean, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. So it's like if you put your thumb over the end of a hose and the water starts going out faster. That's what can happen in canyons like this, is it basically takes the winds and funnels them between these canyon walls. And then you also get upslope winds during the afternoon, and that's exactly what we saw yesterday. So weather, fuel, and topography, all an aspect on this one. And while we're here, there was enough wind yesterday to lead to some spot fires, and that's certainly something we'll be watching throughout the day today, especially with how close that spot fire came to Mineral. And it looks like that one's kicking up some smoke at the moment near Mineral. So that kind of summarizes, I believe, what the fire has been doing and why we've had a lot of that growth yesterday. Now we can look at kind of maybe some good news on this fire, because I just said a lot of things that are going to be working against us. The fact that the fuels aren't changing from yesterday, neither is topography, and the weather actually might even be drier this afternoon than yesterday. The good news, though, we do have over 6,500 personnel, some crews coming from all over the place, from Utah, from Texas, the National Guard's getting called in. And if we look at watch duty, they're already using a lot of the air attack. I've noticed a lot of helicopters on this west side of the fire, which apparently the west side calmed down pretty well overnight last night. And then on the east side of this fire, I've been watching some of the big tankers moving in right there. So doubt they're able to do anything in front of the fire just because it's so smoky, but it does look like they're kind of pinning this and trying to at least keep it from not going too far to the west or the east. But it's going to be very difficult to stop this from continuing to go up the Mill Creek drainage and towards the northeast. So we have a lot of resources on the fire. They're using those resources right now. And then they also, as I mentioned, had that week last week where the weather was working in our favor. Some cooler air, some more moisture moved in not this last Saturday, but the Saturday before that. And then all of last week, we didn't see all that much growth. So while that was happening, they saw what was coming on this northeastern side of the fire, and they were preparing for it. The red, it's kind of hard to see just because this map is so busy, but the fact that this map is busy is good news, and I'll explain that in a second. The fire perimeter, you can kind of see it. It's that red line right there. What's obstructing our view is all of these black X's basically all over the place. Those are the Dozer lines that they were putting in when this fire wasn't as active. So we got really lucky that we did have that week of kind of minimal weather out there, because they were able to do all of this work. Like you look at, that's Mill Creek right there. Oh, I probably should have done this at the beginning of the video. Where am I concerned about on this map? Because I forgot to click kind of the most important button here. structures, we zoom in, we have Mineral up towards the north, and then we have Mill Creek up towards kind of the northeast. And then you look at the wind direction, it's coming from the southwest, so that's going to try to take that heat and push it directly towards those communities. Not saying that to kind of scare anybody, but I am saying that just because it's the truth, and I'm concerned about those communities throughout the day today. We can just also measure it from the spot fire to Mineral. That's going to be about 1.7 miles. From the main fire to Mineral, that's going to be about 3.6 miles. And then I'm not too concerned about the spot fire going straight east to Mill Creek. That one's most likely going to move up towards the north with those southwesterly winds. More concerned about down here moving up towards Mill Creek. That's going to be about 2.6 miles. And then where some of the bad news comes in is we have very similar conditions to what we had yesterday. And yesterday the fire moved about 5.75 miles. And obviously these are all a lot of estimates that I'm throwing out there, but I've generally found that tool reliable as long as you're measuring kind of the perimeter as well as you can and not so much the heat detections. I am interested to see if we do have some heat detections coming off the fire. Not so much right now. So that's at least maybe some good news right there. We're not seeing too much activity on it, and we will look at it from the satellite. We'll look at a camera in just a moment, but I want to finish that thought that I had earlier, which is why I showed you where those structures are. Again, we have Mineral up there, Mill Creek right there. That's where they've been putting these dozer lines all over the place. So they've been preparing these communities, preparing the structures, not only putting in primary lines, but secondary and then contingency, just in anticipation that this fire would move up towards the northeast. So with that being said, now let's actually look at what the fire looks like right now. Looks like there's some smoke coming off of it. It appears there's maybe it's starting to pick up a little bit. You notice you're not seeing those big kind of white spots on it just yet, which means it doesn't look like it's broken through the inversion like it did yesterday. One thing we can do there to answer that question is to click right here. This is going to be the Colby Mountain camera. So from the east looking at the fire from the west, or from the east looking at the eastern side of the fire. That's a confusing way to say that. First thing I noticed, if you looked closely, you could see some of those red strips showing up. That's some of the air attack or air operations dropping some of the retardant. If we zoom in right there, you can actually, can't do that. You can actually see one of those tankers right there. But I wasn't really paying attention to what was going on. Decent amount of smoke coming off of it. I would say the first thing that I noticed, though, blue skies. So that was what worked against us yesterday. What I was kind of hoping would happen overnight is that a lot of that smoke that we produced yesterday with the calmer winds overnight would just settle down over the fire, and then we'd be socked in throughout the entire day. Like some of those days last week where our solar radiation didn't pick up all that much because the smoke was blocking us so much. But it unfortunately looks like we started out with clear skies. And then I also mentioned we started out with very dry conditions. The relative humidity didn't go up overnight. It stayed, I heard in one of the higher elevations, around 8%. And then in another location around, I believe they said 28%. Or no, they said 18%. And we are starting to see that smoke lift a bit higher. So it does look like that inversion's starting to lift. And what I mean by that is in the morning you have very cold air at the surface. So that's kind of how your atmosphere wants to be. It's cold, dense air at the bottom, warm air up top. That's like when your salad dressing separates into the different layers and it has, by its different density of the liquids that are inside there. So when that happens, there's not going to be much movement in the atmosphere because you have cold, dense air below, your warm, less dense air. They're in a happy position. But what happens when you have clear skies is it starts to heat up the surface a lot more. So then the surface becomes less dense, and then it's going to want to rise. And that's like shaking up your salad dressing. And when that happens, you get a lot more airflow. You get a lot more ventilation to the fire, which provides more oxygen. It's able to pick up some of those burning embers, lead to spot fires, and you end up seeing the fire just take off like we were seeing yesterday. And a big part of the comparison to yesterday is going to be how our weather conditions are changing. So just looking at some of the stations on the ground right now, you can tell it's going to be a hot one. So we have Mineral up here, Mill Creek right there. Mill Creek is already 84 degrees, and min relative humidity for today is already showing 13%. And keep in mind that usually your hottest, driest part of the day is going to be around 3 to 4 p.m. in the afternoon. So we'll be getting up into the 90s, and then min relative humidity might even drop into the single digits. The one thing working in our favor, if you look at a lot of these red numbers, not all that windy out there, showing 5 to 8 mile per hour winds. So overall, this is more fuel driven and kind of moisture driven, not so much wind. But with that being said, once you break through that inversion and it starts creating all that ventilation like I was talking about, and you're shaking up the salad dressing, the fire can actually just start to create its own wind. It kind of builds up momentum when you get all that rising motion. Something has to come in to take the place of that air that rose, so then that can lead to basically where the wildfire just starts creating its own weather. So when it comes to these conditions, we saw that it's hot and it's dry, not so windy. When it comes to those temperatures, we are about 5 to even 15 degrees above average throughout the day today. We are hopefully going to be cooling down tomorrow. I haven't actually looked at tomorrow's forecast for the fire area, but I know I just spent my morning forecasting for the Central Coast, and we start a cool down tomorrow, and then that lasts through the rest of the week. So today may be the hardest or the worst fire weather forecast that we have, but it does look like it's going to remain dry like we're seeing. So this is what our water vapor or our relative humidity looked like over the weekend. Remember, we had all that moisture move up. We even got some rain on the fire, some wet thunderstorms. They were beneficial. But watch what has happened since this weekend. That moisture has moved out, and what's taken its place is this very dry air. I also notice the southwesterly wind direction right there, even though winds aren't all that strong. So it's very dry over the fire as that moisture has moved out. We've been on that warming, the increase in solar radiation, actually an increase in winds as well, expecting some gusts around 15 miles per hour this afternoon. And then we've been getting drier. You see those relative humidity values tank over the last few days, and then also temperature going up, expecting it to be actually slightly warmer today. So that was a lot of charts right there. This one is always confusing when I first show it, but I'll try my best to explain it. So this column on the left is today's temperature, wind, relative humidity. This column in dark shading is going to be tonight, and then that is tomorrow. So it's all right that I didn't look at tomorrow's forecast just yet because we've got it right here. So for today, the temperature looks like and when you have a fire this big, it's kind of hard to do a weather forecast because there's going to be different forecasts depending on where you're talking about. So I just tried to pick a point location as close as I could to Mill Creek because that's where it seems like a lot of the activity is right now. So based on that point location, temperature going up into the mid to high 90s. So very hot once again, if not maybe slightly hotter than yesterday. Relative humidity down here dropping into the single digits, which means even drier than yesterday. And then a key part about tonight is that although our temperature will be dropping into the 60s, which is better than last night, I believe it stayed in the 70s last night, relative humidity not coming up very much. You see it stays 20 to 25% overnight. What we would like to see is for that overnight humidity to go up to 70 to 80%, have the moisture go back into our fuels, really calm down the fire behavior, but it looks like it's going to be staying dry once again. And then when we look at tomorrow, once again very hot, once again very dry in the single digits, and then tomorrow night, not seeing all that much moisture moving in over the fire. So the basic summary right there is we're going to have very challenging conditions today, mostly due to the fact that it's hot, dry, with abundant fuels that haven't burned out in decades. Winds showing from the southwest, so because of that, we are going to continue to see that fire move towards the northeast, although this one isn't primarily wind driven. The largest wind impacts on this fire will most likely actually just be due to the winds that the fire is creating itself. So hopefully that supplied a lot of the information that you've been looking for on the park fire. I'll kind of wrap this one up right now just because I want to keep it relatively concise. And then once we see this activity pick up more this afternoon, I'll most likely do an extended live stream where we really keep an eye on Mineral and Mill Creek to just try to figure out how far this fire is moving and just stay updated with the fire throughout this afternoon, because unfortunately I think it is going to be very active, especially around 4 to 7 p.m. So you can stay tuned for that update. Hopefully this one was helpful, and thanks for watching.